In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Samantha Mellinger is the editor of the Long Beach Business Journal, a publication that has existed for well over 30 years, reporting on the business community, primarily in the greater Long Beach area. Today on our program, Ms. Mellinger and I will be discussing and analyzing the local and regional economic climate. Welcome to our program, Samantha.
Thank you
We're
for
so
having
happy
me.
to have you here, taking time out of your busy schedule as being an editor of this fine publication. Why is by all indications, Samantha, the economy is doing very, very well. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, we've had very slow and sustained growth for about 10 years now, since the end of the recession. And we're actually approaching the longest period of economic growth that this country has ever seen. The reason for that is that following the recession, the federal government kind of put a tight lid on lending restrictions. They poured some money into the economy by buying bonds, quantitative easing, they call it. They kept interest rates, they slashed interest rates and then kept them low. And individuals and businesses were reticent to make risky investments, and they were also kind of prevented from that due to some of those restrictions. And what you saw as a result is slow growth in gross domestic product and in consumer spending over the past 10 years. But recently, we've obviously seen a spurt.
Well, we've seen a spurt because of the tax cut.
Correct.
That the Trump administration has championed, but it was really the Congress under Paul Ryan who initiated it and passed it.
Correct.
Should they get the kudos for this economy taking the spike up from the slow growth?
Sure. Well, I don't know if I have the authority to give anybody the kudos for economic growth, but certainly,
They
Congress
played a role.
passed it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly. But since they did, the first quarter was a little slow still, and you really saw the impact come around in the second quarter where GDP doubled compared to the first quarter, and that's because people had more money in their pockets and they were seeing the benefits of wage gains.
Well, it's not a slam dunk that when you do a tax cut, that the business community is going to reinvest through it with paying people more money, mm-hmm. Wages, as well as hiring people. New people. But in fact, we're seeing the beginnings of that in this tax cut, are we not?
We definitely are. After the tax cuts, you had some massive corporations. I couldn't even list them all because they were in the dozens, really, come out and say, we're hiring X many people, we're investing in these workforce development programs, we're going to increase these benefits. Boeing was one. Obviously, that has a local impact. And locally, the economy has been growing anyway, but I've spoken with businesses. We recently did a focus on Douglas Park, and most of the companies located there that I interviewed, and I probably interviewed around 20, said that they were growing and they were hiring.
What types of, and these are manufacturing, not heavy manufacturing businesses, but manufacturing businesses nonetheless, because we were saying nationally manufacturing is over
Right.
because it was been
Mm-hmm.
shipped across the seas. But what types of manufacturing companies are we seeing at Douglas Park?
Sure. It's interesting you make that observation. I've had conversations with folks at the city and their workforce development department about sort of the future of manufacturing and how it's changing. You're not seeing the same large-scale manufacturing like you did with McDonnell Douglas back in the day, but you are seeing some smaller scale manufacturing.
For
that's
instance?
Still significant. Virgin Orbit over at Douglas Park, they're manufacturing satellite launchers. So if you go toward their facility, you'll see them literally building rockets. That's one. You have a printer toner supplier over there. You have Rubbercraft, who manufactures polymer products.
Who is instrumental in getting these manufacturing companies to come at Douglas Park?
Well, actually the real estate community, I would say, because that was a huge undeveloped parcel of land,
Yes.
and there's very little industrial property available in the South Bay and near the ports, for example. Mm-hmm. So that was really the only opportunity when that got built out to move into a larger facility or to build something to scale to handle that. So a lot of companies moved that needed to grow from like Gardena and Carson to snatch up some of those industrial properties.
Also, we're seeing a lot of construction going on in the city of Long Beach. It's characterized this city more than I've ever seen. I've been in the city a long time. We're seeing a lot of construction that's going on, particularly in the downtown area.
Yes.
Why is that, and who's benefiting from that? What type of construction are we seeing?
Well, you're seeing a lot of investment on the part of real estate developers. When I speak with economists, they tell me Long Beach has been kind of overlooked as a place to invest for many years, kind of I hate it when people say this, but the stepchild to Los Angeles.
I've heard that many times.
Yes. But real estate developers are now realizing that it's a more affordable opportunity. It's a growing city. It's the only downtown on the waterfront between San Diego and San Francisco. There's growing businesses here. So you're seeing, and there's a great need for housing. So you're seeing as parcels become available, they're just getting snapped up, mostly by apartment developers.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned about housing. The median cost of housing in Southern California is like $600,000.
That's right.
And despite the fact that there's a lot of housing development going on, there's still a shortage in housing right now. What's going to be done about that?
Well, that's a complicated question. When you speak with economists, for example, or builders, or the real estate community, what's really holding back development, because we're actually underbuilding. We are seeing a surge in development because the economy is doing well, but it could be doing better. I think we're supposed to be building to meet demand something like 100,000 units per year, and we're only building 80 statewide. And that's because of environmental regulations, such as the California Environmental Quality Act, kind of need to be revisited. It causes developers to have to jump kind of through too many loopholes. There's too many opportunities for developments to be nixed. In some cases, obviously, there's good reason for that, but in some cases, these processes get dragged out so long that the developers no longer have any money left to really put into it.
And so in that case, that's when the executive should come in and say, okay, we got potential businesses coming into the city or in this county. Can we cut some of these regulations? And then, of course, on the other side, they say, well, these regulations are needed. So it gets bogged down. And in that case, what would the mayor of a city do in that
Well, Mayor
case?
Garcia has been very pro-development, smart development in the downtown and along like the metro corridor. So he's sort of championed housing. It's not as much of an issue in Long Beach, I think, because everybody recognizes that we have a need for affordable housing, but you do see it in places. My brother lives in the Bay Area, and a lot of housing projects there get nixed because the neighborhoods don't want them. They don't want more people coming in there. We don't have that attitude in Long Beach, but it is a problem.
Well, you mentioned Oakland and San Francisco. San Francisco was dragging in terms of economic growth for a while, and then we see, at least the reports that I've been getting, is Oakland and San Francisco are on the upsurge, just like Long Beach. And those are port cities. Does it have anything to do with, and we'll talk about trade in a second, but does it have anything to do with those cities being port cities as well?
You know, I wouldn't be able to tell you that one.
Okay. Now, I'd like for us to turn to the tariffs. The tariff policies of the administration. The Trump administration, and some even not so many some business people say that we've been getting the short end of the deal in terms of trade deals. And that's why the Trump administration is saying we want a fair share. We've been losing, and we're looking recently at NAFTA. But these tariffs that are being tried to be administered by the Trump administration, what type of effect would that have on our local Long Beach economy?
It depends upon the tariffs, but specifically we need to be looking at what's going on with China, which obviously is the source of kind of the back and forth with the tariffs, the trade war discussion.
Yes.
About 80%, I think, of cargo coming through the San Pedro Bay ports, coming in and going out, is sourced from China or going to China. So if the tariffs keep escalating, right now I think it's 25% tariffs on 60 billion worth of goods, something like that, I believe. If they keep escalating, that will cause trade to be restricted because a tariff is essentially a tax or a fee, and you're artificially inflating the price of those goods to ship them overseas.
There's a reaction to that.
There's a
If I put a
reaction.
tariff on you, then you're going to put a tariff on me.
Right, and eventually that discourages the movement of goods because it's too expensive to ship them, and those costs will get passed on to the consumer. And then the argument in favor would be, well, that might stimulate some domestic production. However, when we're talking about the Long Beach economy, a major sector for us is trade and logistics and warehousing in terms of employment. And if trade were to slow down through the ports, those jobs would be affected.
What type of jobs?
We're talking about rail workers, longshoremen, dock workers, truck drivers, warehouse workers.
It's like a domino effect there.
Customs brokering, I mean, even law to a degree, and at the very end of it, retail. So yes, it could cause some problems.
And looking in the article that you recently said, the San Pedro Harbor would probably be the most affected, at least from a local standpoint.
Absolutely.
Why so? Because they have those types of businesses?
Because that's a major sector of employment. The San Pedro Bay ports are the largest port complex in the United States.
Really?
Yes, they handle 40% about of the share of maritime trade coming into this country, and most of it through these ports is coming from or going to China. So if tariffs continue to escalate with China, it's sort of an obvious conclusion to draw that if that trade is restricted, all of the ancillary industries that support those massive ports could be affected negatively.
So when we look at that situation and we look at what needs to be done, obviously it has the business community, at least that industry, nervous about what's going on. What then traditionally would be done to kind of try to circumvent that?
The tariffs?
Yeah, we're talking about this China-United States pull and tug in terms of threatening, the Trump administration threatening tariffs. At that point, we have two opposing viewpoints. How can that be resolved?
I don't know. I mean, we're kind of in uncharted territory, and obviously we're dealing with an administration whose policies are not as predictable as prior administrations, and it has kind of been par for the course that free trade is the accepted, mode of things for the past few presidencies. So this is kind of uncharted territory in recent times, so I'm not quite sure. Obviously, the administration is trying to intimidate China so that we can get some gains in trade, and it just depends on how long that process drags out, what the impacts will be.
Well, when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the performance of the mayor of this city in terms of the policies that he is at least championing, if not instituting, and who in a city like Long Beach, what entity in a city like Long Beach are significant players in terms of the economy being boosted. Now we got a national situation, but in a city like Long Beach, you have city council members, you got the mayor, you got some of the business organizations. We want to find out what roles they play in terms of the economy being boosted right after we take a short break.
Okay.
We're visiting with Samantha Mellinger, who is the editor of the Long Beach Business Journal, and we're going to talk about the mayor, this office of the mayor and the city council in terms of this economic growth that we're experiencing here in Long Beach. We'll be right back after these messages. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. We're visiting with Samantha Mellinger, who's the editor of the Long Beach Business Journal, and we were talking about tariffs, and we're talking about the economy, and we were talking about possible trade wars. But I'd like to turn our attention right now, Samantha, to the office of the mayor and in a local economy. And we see a lot of construction that's going on. We see a lot of good things going on. And then if I see some good things going on, I say, who's responsible for these good things? Now, the city of Long Beach, which is the local government, is totally responsible for things. How much credit does a mayor get, or either Mayor Garcia gets, Mayor
Garcia.
Garcia gets, in terms of the boost in the local economy?
I think it's only natural that people typically give credit to whoever is in power at the time that the economy is doing well. You can compare it to past presidents. President Obama came in when the economy crashed, but was that his fault? President Trump is overseeing a period of growth. Is that entirely because of President Trump? And you can kind of say a similar thing when it comes to mayoral leadership. Mayor Garcia has been pro-business in some ways. He has reestablished the economic development department of the city. That was one of the first things he did when he became mayor.
Now that's wise, to appoint someone who in a position, like we're talking about the economy, someone who knows the economy, somebody that's respected and can give good advice. And that's what, apparently that's what you're saying that the mayor did.
Yes, he reestablished the Economic Development Department, and John Keisler is in charge of it. He's somebody who's been with the city a long time and is kind of an ideas guy. And he's done a really good job in putting forward some programs and policies to help businesses, and particularly entrepreneurs start up. He's trying to take another look at business licensing to make that process less onerous. He helped lead an effort to create an online portal that takes businesses all the way through, like startup to opening, even in terms of not just stuff you're dealing with the city, but how to get funding. We have a small business ombudsman now. There's all kinds of things.
One of the big things that small businesses, or even large businesses, but mainly small businesses, one of the biggest griefs they have is that it's too much regulation. They have to jump over too many hoops, and it costs them money. What has Mr. Kaiser did to kind of alleviate that?
Well, I think business licensing, him taking a look at that, if something comes to fruition with that, I know it's kind of a process, that would really help businesses if that process were easier. He's made the department, just by virtue of having the department and having more people on staff, I think they're more accessible now. You also have, for instance, one of our council members, Janine Pierce, she has proposed cutting conditional use permit costs for entertainment. That's something that could really help business. So that's something that's coming up. We could see that would really be helpful in terms of cutting red tape.
What role does the city council play in terms of this economic growth? We talk about the mayor, we talk about the city government in terms of Mr. Kaiser and the economic development contingent, but what role does this city council play? When somebody is elected city council, people generally, the electorate really just say, well, he's a good, well, sometimes they do say that, he's a good business person. But looking at this council comprehensively, what role has this council played in the last couple of years in terms of this economic growth?
Well, the city council sets policy, they create ordinances which can guide, they can create business restrictions, or they can help them in some ways.
Who's been taking the lead in that on the city council?
Well, it depends which side we're talking about. So in terms of creating restrictions, you have the environmental side. You have proposals that have been put forth about banning styrofoam. That one passed, although a lot of the businesses are on board with that because they see the negative impact it has on our local harbor, but it is an additional cost. The council was also pushing an increase in minimum wage, which ended up being a non-issue because the state passed its own policy.
Okay.
But that process was kind of difficult for the business community as the council was going through it. There was a policy being proposed that's now going to the ballot because it didn't pass the council to regulate hotel work hours and to provide workers with panic buttons.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's reasons for that. But so those are some examples of, it's kind of a mixed bag actually from the city council.
Now we look at, when we talk about environmental restrictions, we look at the west side of Long Beach, which has the rail system going on the west side of Long Beach. And there's always been a big fight in terms of the trucking industry and the railroads. Is that a big conflict in terms of a city council person saying, whoa, because we got polluted air coming from the port, and then some council people who are maybe pro-business saying, let's ease up on the restrictions. Is that a clash?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up. There is a project that's caused a lot of that kind of debate recently that's coming up for the Port of Long Beach. It's the expansion of Pier B's on-dock rail.
Right. That's right.
Yes. The West Side businesses that are there, I went over and sat down with a bunch of them. They were very unhappy because many of them, it's going to either butt up right against their business. And we're talking about companies that are dealing with like Disneyland and Starbucks, and that's going to negatively impact them. Some that would actually be wiped out by the rail lines. If you look at the environmental impact report, there are concerns in terms of impacts to health, but the port argues that overall rail will reduce truck trips, which will overall reduce emissions and reduce health impacts. But I'm not necessarily the expert in that, but that's the debate that's happening. It did pass. The council member for that district, Lena Gonzalez, did, I know, meet with the businesses, and I know that she does have concerns, but it did pass. So it is moving forward, and we'll see how that process unwinds.
Well, I want to talk about a journalistic question here. You are editor of the Business Journal. What role does the Business Journal play in this economy here? What are you guys trying to do in terms of your business publication, and so that means you're pro-business? But what kind of role does a newspaper like yours play in a city like ours? Role that you're actually trying to play?
Well, I think it says on the cover of our paper, we want to be the voice of business. We want to know what businesses are going through, whether that's dealing with city government, dealing with the state government. We want to know what's helping them be successful. We want to know if they're growing, but we also want to know if they're facing some difficulties. And part of that is also engaging with the city government, county government, state government. We have some proposals coming up on the ballot that could really impact businesses. There's a parcel tax proposed for the county that's meant to create funds for stormwater abatement, which could really help our harbor on the one hand. On the other hand, it's going to add a tax for like all impenetrable concrete. So basically any industrial business is going to be affected pretty significantly by that tax. So those are some of the things that we kind of try to keep an eye on in advance of them happening so that the business community is aware and we get their feedback.
That's very, very, very important. How did you get in this business? You're the editor of Long Beach Business Journal. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into this.
My background is actually in creative writing. I have a BFA in fiction writing.
BFA, what's that?
A bachelor's in fine arts.
Okay.
And I have a master's in fine arts from Long Beach State. When I was at Chapman University, I took a theater abroad course, and my professor kind of took me under his wing, and he knew I was good at writing, and he said, why don't you write about something you love? So he got me in with a theater publication in LA, and I continued writing for them all the way through graduate school and decided to give the journalism thing a try. And I saw a position open at the Business Journal a little bit after I graduated, and I'd applied to a lot of places. The economy was still pretty rough in Long Beach at that time. And I figured, well, I don't know much about business, but I love Long Beach at the time. Now I know much more about business.
Obviously,
yes. And I applied, and they gave me a shot, and I sort of hit the ground running, actually as staff writer.
Give us a sneak preview of what might be coming up in the Business Journal that your readers might be interested in, that you see on the horizon.
Okay, I can give you our next edition, for example. We've got our annual interview with Mayor Robert Garcia.
Okay.
Our focus on corporate presence, where we talk to a lot of the major corporations that have operations in town about how they're doing, or this time we're actually asking them what they want to see in the future workforce. So if they were to talk to high school students, what would they tell them to pursue?
That's good.
We're going to be talking about the parcel tax I mentioned.
Parcel tax, tell us about that.
It's the one that has to do with stormwater funding, and that's going to really hit some real estate and owners
what
of
part
businesses. Everybody who owns any real estate will be affected by that.
How so?
Parcel tax. Well, I'm not an expert on the tax, but assuming that you have any kind of spot on your property where water could run off into the gutter, you're going to be hit with the tax, and that's supposed to fund stormwater abatement. So if chemicals are running off your property, the county can fund ways to counteract that.
So you've been editor for how long now?
Since January, I became assistant editor last year and was promoted to editor this year.
I want to ask you a question about Mayor Garcia. Since you have been with the newspaper, and you guys sit down with him annually,
Yes.
what can you see from this mayor that has shown some maturity and growth that we should be cognizant of? At some point, you can see him in perspective in terms of what he's doing with this city. What difference have you seen in the last 2 or 3 years with him? Maybe in some growth area as the mayor.
Ooh, that's a tough question because he came in with a lot of experience already on the city council.
Yes.
And I think he's been pretty smart about the way that he's approached his job as mayor. He knows that it's the city council's job really to set the policy.
Mm-hmm.
I think he obviously guides that to a degree where he can, but he kind of stays out on the major quabbles, some of the major debates until the end. So I don't know quite how I would answer that question. He's always engaged with the community. I think maybe he's engaged more so with the business community over the years. But
And he's been a proponent of education as well. And we're talking
that
about
was his
business.
big thing from day one, yeah,
Yes.
because he's an educator.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, we've enjoyed talking with you, Samantha, and I've known about your newspaper or Georgia County News as a publisher for many, many years, and most people feel like your newspaper is very fair. There's some very challenging things coming up in this city, and the voice of a business journal, a business newspaper has a vital role to play. And we thank you for coming on the television program, Conversations with Erroll Parker, to talk about this.
Thank you for having me.
We just visited with Samantha Mellinger, and she's the editor of Long Beach Business Journal, which is a very important, plays a very important role in not only in our economy, but informing the business community of what's coming on the horizon. We thank you for coming on the program, and we'll be back next week with an exciting guest on Conversations with Erroll Parker. Please join us. Good night. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. The current United States immigration policy has been one of the most divisive and complicated national policies in American history. Pro and con public debate and protest have divided this country in much the same manner as the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. Today on our program, we have two very passionate spokesmen on this hot-button issue. Dr. James Monceau Salceda, who is the director of the Multicultural Center at California State University, Long Beach, and Armando Vasquez Ramos, who is the coordinator of the California-Mexico Project. Welcome to our program, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Two old friends, and we're going
Indeed.
to cut up about this policy the United States has
Yes.
in terms of immigration. And I want to challenge you guys a couple of times in terms of this policy. Let's take a look. There are some myths, Armando and James, about immigration in the United States, that the current immigrant population is taking the jobs from the current low-income Americans. Is that a myth, James, or is that true?
Well, that's typical rhetoric of fear mongering. It's always been in the entire history. By the way, there's no time in American history that we've had a coherent immigration policy. So the idea that this is new, I would challenge that. I would say this is not new. Look at the 19th century. Look at every immigrant group that's come here, whether from Europe or from Asia or from Mexico. They have been demonized in the same way. That's one of the oldest chestnuts used, and just all the changes is the cultural group you're using it against.
And this has been a worldwide view. Not just the United States. All other countries, when they have had new immigrants,
Yeah.
Armando, have demonized or attempted to demonize. Yet this population is needed. Any population that comes to a country economically is needed. Is that true?
Absolutely. And I think to add to what James has just stated, we have a history of anti-immigrant
Yes.
You mean the
racism.
United States?
The United States. So without going into what's happening today worldwide, which is a very similar paradigm, what we're looking at here is another cycle of what has happened since the founding days of our nation. What is uniquely different in terms of how European groups were discriminated, were exploited? When we're talking about Italians or Irish or Polish or whatever European immigrant population, they differed in terms of color. And they blended into that whole concept of the melting pot. That applies to white Americans. It does not apply to people of color. Whether they're the ancestors of African Americans that were brought here by force as slaves, or in our case, Latinos, Mexicans in particular, that were the dwellers of this land, along with the American Indian, were not only stripped of their land, but also were systematically exterminated. We're talking about genocide.
Yes.
So I think that it begs the question, what happens for 100 years since emancipation and what culminates with a civil rights movement that you and I were a part of in the 50s and the 60s, and that we assume had eliminated this history of violence and racism and discrimination. What we're seeing today is an awakening of folks that have always had that racism, and generations that have followed, that have been submerged since the 60s and the 70s, but that attain a mouthpiece in the form of Trump.
I see you nodding with
Because
agreement.
what we're seeing is there's simply permission to say what you already believed but had suppressed. And I think there was a general naivete. We have a black president. As if that changed the root system of racism that has been institutionalized and systemic from all our history. And there was, so I find it very different. I like the word crisis. It's a Greek word that really means turning point. I was agreeing with you, Armando, earlier when we were talking that a crisis is a positive thing because it clarifies decisions that must be made. The challenge is to make that decision in a direction that is supportive of a new national identity.
Do you see that happening in the United States?
I see that potential in this crisis.
There's no evidence of that you've seen that lately at all?
Well, I think we're seeing when people see the destruction of families, to see something they've never seen before. It's like watching the civil rights on TV, and they're seeing children with attack dogs. Now they're seeing an immigration policy that is brutal, callous, that is creating trauma for children, that has no relationship to a policy. That's a decision that had nothing to do with policy. It has to do with a meanness of spirit. And that's clarifying. We need to see that. In other words, I'd rather a racist, for example, be bald-faced racist than a racist that smiles and stabs me in the back.
Another myth, gentlemen, that we see is that illegal immigrants that come into the country is draining the economy of health services because they have to go to, there's no preventative service, they have to go to the emergency ward. They're draining the economy of some things that the native citizens could be benefiting from. Is that a myth as well, Armando?
Yeah, it's a total myth, and it's part of this spin in a racist campaign that starts with Trump declaring that Mexico sends criminals, rapists, murderers. And what was the dog whistle for that base that he has targeted and continues to speak to, which is your extreme right-wing racist. There's no other way to look at it. Now, let me also make the following observation. We have now entered a period that is not only during Trump, it's also Obama. During Obama's administration, there was almost 3 million immigrants deported. 96% of those were Latinos. There's something wrong with that. And it was a systematic targeting of deportations by the Obama administration because he wanted to seem hardline. He wanted to bring Republicans to the table and negotiate immigration reform.
Was he successful in doing that?
Absolutely not.
No. But let me back up too, even in the phrasing of the question. Human beings are not illegal by birth. The fact that we create a term, illegal alien,
Yeah, that term.
pre-shapes your ability to see. If you said undocumented worker,
Is that a better term?
well, they're coming to work to have a better life. But the only time I refer to you as a criminal term, it erases the possibility of me seeing your humanity or even understanding it's a family seeking a better life, who are hardworking and honest. But if you have at the top someone saying rapists and criminals instead of hardworking and honest, well, you have it's shaped in our language of immigration, just the very phraseology.
Armando.
It's dehumanizing, but let me expand on that a little bit more. Fundamentally, what we're going through is another cycle in U.S. history with folks that have always hated immigrants. What we're looking at now, in the aftermath of the Obama administration, given this massive deportation that I mentioned, what we have also caused is the exile into Mexico and Latin and Central America of more than 800,000 U.S. citizen children that were born and forced into exile with the deportation of their parents. That's an issue today that is off the headlines, and there is no concern with a violation of human rights, of children's rights, and certainly
who should be-
citizenship, constitutional rights of a U.S. citizen.
Who should be calling the task of a policy that's so divisive and dehumanizing? What apparatus does this country have to call the task of accountability then?
We are at a standstill because we have total control of government. All three branches of government are controlled by the same party, the same right-wing mentality. So Congress is totally unresponsive. The Supreme Court is about to become overloaded with conservatives, more like zealots. The administration will not change in 2 more years, even if there's a change in the control of Congress in November. The bottom line here is that we're incapable of bringing to a court the case of these U.S. citizen children that are stuck in hell in Mexico.
You're painting he is painting a pretty bleak picture, James.
Well, this is back to crisis, though. What it's doing is clarifying what we are and what we're doing. Does the nation want this to be the nation? In other words, it takes the vagueness out. And what we're seeing, and I think, again, it's like we don't have healthy venues in the nation where, aside from politics, that's not the voice of our neighborhoods. That's not the voice of our neighbors. We've let sort of media conglomerates shape everything. And we're not hearing from people. You know, you lose the election by losing a popular vote, but you would never know that the popular vote didn't vote in this president.
So what are you saying? With all this multimedia outlets that we have in this country, you still are saying that immigrants don't have a voice and those who are advocating for immigrants don't have a voice. Is that what we're saying?
And I think that the fact is that media plays to ratings. Media plays to whatever is the most profitable bottom line. Now, let me get back to the question about health services and how immigrants are perceived to abuse. immigrants are not eligible
Right.
for health services. And no immigrant has ever drawn from the system more than they put in.
Yes.
Otherwise, immigrants would not be attracted by a magnet of employers that want to pay cheap labor. Now, are they taking away jobs from Americans?
That is what is
Absolutely
being
not.
said.
Absolutely not, because Americans are unwilling to do the jobs that these young people, predominantly, are willing to do. And I would say that the worst fear that this is responding to, number one, taking back America was a racist reaction to a black man being elected our president. But the other, the anti-immigrant mood, comes from 2 decades ago when philosophers like Mr. Huntington, Harvard philosopher, who produced this idea that Latinos were the worst element to fear, worse than Middle Easterns, because of our potential growth into a separate society. I don't blame them. The fact is that Latinos have grown into a 60 million population
In this
the
country.
US, in this country. So we are threatening that way, but we're going back to the difference is that we are not white. And otherwise, this immigrant cycle is no different than any previous cycle. It's productive, it creates wealth, and they are the future of our retirement, Earl. They're going to sustain our Social Security, and it's
Before you get started,
Yeah.
we got to take a break.
Okay.
Okay.
Let's do
But
that.
but I want you to pick up on your point. But
Sure.
I also, in the second segment, guys, I want to talk. Well, then what would be a good national policy on immigration? Let's talk about that. Let's
Okay.
put that on the table.
Sure.
But hold your point. I know you're going to
Sure.
respond to something,
Yeah.
Armando.
Okay.
We're going to be right back with these two gentlemen talking about the national immigration policy of this country after these messages. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker. Welcome back. We're visiting with two proponents of the change, at least in American perception of immigrants, James Salceda and Armando Vasquez Ramos. We're talking about this immigration policy to the United States of America, and I want to get into that in terms of what some policy changes that can be made in that respect. But James, you were going to make a point about the future.
Yes.
About the vision of
imminent
Yes.
generational voice that is just emerging right now. When you had mentioned in your opener about a galvanized America around an issue like Vietnam, this is the issue that will galvanize a new generation. They do not think the way Congress thinks. They are not coming from an old racist Jim Crow mindset. They grew up in a globalized society. They crisscross culture, ethnicity, and religion with ease. They find themselves allies to any number of groups. They will be not only voting, they will become the leaders we're voting for. And I think one of the things people act as if this old guard is going to continue. It will not.
Well, now, the old guard might be dying off because of age, but do we see young Americans who are very conservative about immigration policy still
Well, sure,
existing?
of course. Though that doesn't, what changes has to do with a synergy of thought, with how do you engage that conservative view, as you had mentioned earlier, in a civil way. Divisiveness comes with incivility. I don't care how well we believe what we believe, there should be a way for us to understand how and why we believe it.
That's right.
And from there, options open. But we're in a transition where anger and violence and knee-jerk response goes viral before any fact-checking, any evidence, any context.
So you condemn what you don't know. Which
That's
is one
what
of the
happens,
worst.
right?
Yes.
What you're programmed to condemn,
Yes.
what you're programmed to believe. And quite frankly, I'm pleased with the transformation that is happening. Not that I'm happy because we're suffering through it,
Yes.
but I'm happy that this will also change the nation. This will also pressure younger generations to take the leadership. Let me make this point.
Okay.
I am very disappointed. I am totally beyond belief that almost 2 years since this nightmare began, there's no uprising. There's really no response from young people, from churches, from unions, from educators like ourselves. There is no leadership coming from young people in the universities as we were part of in the 60s and the 70s.
Why is that, you think?
I think that is part of the numbing of this now a process through media and the distraction of electronic devices.
Well, here we have.
But one of the things is in the university setting, which I think can be a preview of positive movement for the nation, our own campus at Cal State Long Beach. So you have a Latina president, a Muslim vice president. You know, you have an ease of leadership, and they're doing social justice on a campus level. That's going to start magnifying beyond a campus. Others are going to say, we like the way that campus gets along. We like the way they work together. Why can't we do that? Or they're becoming more thoughtful about how do they project their own dissent. Is it counterproductive because it's just angry and it's just, and I think we're in a where it's tumultuous,
Okay.
but it's a turning point. That's how we turn, is through tumult. It's not through ease.
Armando, you are the director of ethnic studies in the Long Beach, or ethnic studies programs in the Long Beach Unified School District. What are you trying to do? And I wanted to ask you the same question with the Multicultural Center at Cal State Long Beach. What are you trying to do with ethnic studies with the schools?
Let me clarify that, because I'm not employed by the school district. I'm still a professor part-time, retired from the university, but I created this program 3 years ago to enable us to teach ethnic studies college credit courses from Cal State Long Beach to high school students.
How's that going?
In 6 different high schools in the district. Fantastic. We started with only 1 class at El Rancho Unified, and Long Beach Unified came in big with a commitment of 12 classes every semester, and I just brought in the Norwalk La Mirada School District with 3 additional classes. We're teaching at 10 different high schools, 17 classes every Saturday from 9 to 12, and it's a phenomenal opportunity to teach about what we learned, what we created 50 years ago in the form of ethnic studies, history and culture about American Indians, Asian Americans, African Americans, and Chicano Latinos. So it's a wonderful opportunity to discover how these young people are hungry and are so capable of analyzing the hunger that they have for knowledge about themselves and to interact with the others, to understand better their differences, but appreciate what makes them a unique part of the mosaic of our U.S. society.
See, and that's exactly part of this movement. That helps to re-nourish and empower a new generation who can understand the social justice victories of their own past, who can see and find an identity that is dynamic and forward-moving. So I'm the founding director of the Multicultural Center, which has been open for 26 years. But I'm the first director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs, which is just its 4th year, which is a good example of now what we did at the Multicultural Center as a root system has branched so that it's university-wide. We now support all the 6 student cultural resource centers that had been on campus for 30 years, but never were part of strategic planning, never had staff or support. Now we're starting our 4th year where their vision, we co-create with them and support it. And we're seeing cultural competency training and workshops that we provide to faculty and staff. We're seeing what we've never seen on the campus before. And it's taking that model in a way, but make it campus-wide. And that creates an empowered student who cannot be, as Brother Minister Malcolm X said, won't be bamboozled by these sound bites, and just will be able to use critical thinking as empowerment of authentic voice.
Okay. Now, on the short run, gentlemen, we mentioned what's going to happen in the long run, perhaps. What types of policy changes need to be made in the short term in this national immigration policy? Would you speak to that, and then we'll let James?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the first change has to be in the House of Representatives and possibly in the Senate, in the U.S. Senate, during this year's elections. If there is no change in the control of the legislative power by the Republicans that are totally locked in step with the Trump administration, then there will be no change of any immigration policies whatsoever. I believe that once there's at least one of the two houses in Democratic hands, that you can begin a process of proposing true legislation that can be negotiated, even if the Senate remains a Republican-controlled House. Bottom line, I don't think that anything can happen with the type of racism and the mentality of folks from the White House, as well as the leadership of the U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives. And I think that has to be the first step before we're
So we're talking about an electoral process where...
Absolutely, and that has to start in November of this year.
James?
But one of the things, we need to start with DACA and face it, and because even in Republican circles, that group are not criminals. They are the embodiment of working for an American dream in a way that has produced professionals and have been here for generations. That can be the opening of, that voice needs to be reheard. Who are all of these people and what are they doing? They're contributing to society. They are helping to energize our campuses as professionals. And it's a group that defies the easy rhetoric that paints a single picture. So that would be something that needs to be truly addressed first, I think, in a way, because it's almost a bridge point. It can help people see a different humanity within an immigrant population.
Okay, so you two gentlemen deal with populations of young people across ethnic boundaries. And what we're seeing on television now, Armando, is people shouting at one another who deeply disagree over points of view, over policy, over occurrences. And you have influence and or authority over, and I use the word authority loosely, but over young people who may disagree with you or with themselves. How do we teach young people to respect another person's viewpoint and to understand it? First you, Armando, and then...
I think it all comes down to education. That's why teaching about ethnic studies in the high schools is so fundamentally appropriate today, given the hate coming out of the White House, given the polarization that we are facing throughout the country. Now, how do we get people to understand and appreciate and accept each other's different point of view and racism? That's a key question. We need to understand how racism comes from the home, how the racism is passed down through generations. And the only way to break it down is in the classroom, is through, frankly, even gatherings like we organized back in the 60s against the Vietnam War, teachings, bringing speakers that are on one hand controversial, but not provocateurs, bringing about a dialogue in after a presentation of
So
substance.
should we shut down a very conservative viewpoint speaker to come into a university that has been invited by organization and university, we
No.
shut them down.
Well,
Say, no, you can't come.
No, you can't. That is counterproductive on every level. The best protest to a controversial speaker on a campus would be an empty auditorium. And to have, at the same time that they're speaking, teach-ins available to those who want to
So
actually
you're
learn
saying
about the project.
if a very conservative speaker comes to been invited by the university,
Yes.
don't show up. Don't
No,
come.
I'm saying that students have the empowered free speech to exercise themselves, and that can be a different response. That speaker wants mobs of people yelling at them. That is the game they play. That's the strategy. They will not return to an empty auditorium. Thank you very much.
And that's exactly what we did a few years ago at Cal State Long Beach, when there was a Nazi legislator from the San Diego area that was creating havoc, going to different campuses, and he would be supported by these thugs that would go to campuses looking for headlines through violence.
Yes.
At Cal State Long Beach, we arranged for a debate with Enrique Morones, who's the head of the Border Angels. And what Enrique did, and in a coordinated effort, he started the debate by exposing the racist background of this individual. I wouldn't even mention his name. And at that point, he led a walkout of the entire auditorium. And we left these knuckleheads on the stage with not more than 10 or 15 people. And so I think that it depends on how you handle it. I personally believe that the administration has a responsibility to screen and to ban anyone who is already intending to create violence and conflict, not with an intellectual point of view, because that's how you also eliminate the possibility for this to go out of
We're
hand.
out of time, fellas. You get the last quick comment.
And it's a positive one. The answer, the civil rights movement had a moral compass of nonviolence and civility. We've allowed the civil rights movement to not be passed to another generation. They don't know that Dr. King says our goal with an opponent is not to humiliate or undermine them. It's to understand their view and even make friends of them. That is the high moral compass of the civil rights movement. Ethnic studies will help them relearn what these movements were about.
That's right.
And their behavior had the highest of ideals, and I think that can energize a new generation.
Thank you so much, gentlemen, for old friends coming and talking about this. I would urge you to tell your students to watch this television program so they can decide for themselves some of the truisms that came out of this. James Salceda, thank you so much for coming. Armando Vasquez Ramos, thank you so much for coming on Conversations with Erroll Parker. We hope that you have benefited from these conversations. We want to know what you think. We'll be right back next week with an exciting guest on this program. See you later. In a democracy, citizens need to be informed. Informed about policies, issues, homelessness, law enforcement, and social services. In order for people to make good decisions that affect their lives, they need to be informed. Conversations with Erroll Parker.